Ruth chapter 4 is where we're going to start as we begin our study of God's Word, which is one of the 4 parts of the spiritual growth cycle. Worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. And that next step, love one another, one way that in this congregation that we're helping people to love one another is going to be with small groups or house-to-house groups. And we are about to roll that out very soon. There have been some groups already meeting, sort of pilot groups to kind of work things out and figure it out. And we're very excited about it. It's been very beneficial for those groups. And so soon we'll roll it out for the whole congregation. It's just a terrific way for us to get to know each other better and to connect on a spiritual level with one another, and to get to know one another's needs and to serve others within the congregation. So we're really going to benefit from that once we start that. Tonight is the last class of this quarter because of our gospel meeting that's coming up. We're not going to have any more classes this month. And April 1st will be the first class of next quarter. So what I'm going to do tonight is we're going to finish up the book of Ruth. And we just have one chapter left. We're on chapter 4. And then we're going to do a review of the whole quarter. So in Ruth chapter 4, now I won't kind of rehash the whole story because you heard it on Sunday. Brian talked about it in his sermon. We're pretty familiar with it by now, right? But we got through the part where she basically, in a nonverbal way, asks him to marry her. And you all remember what that entailed with her going and lying down at his feet and uncovering his feet and everything. And he basically tells her what? Yes. Yeah, I like that. One word answer there, Terry. He basically says, yes, I would like to marry you, but what?
So he had to check with another relative.
Yeah, I got to make sure that the one that's a closer relative the closer relative to Elimelech, who was Ruth's father-in-law, who has passed away, the one who's a closer relative would have the right to redeem her. So we'll talk kind of some more about that here as we start. Do y'all remember when in Matthew 22 when the Sadducees came to Jesus and they had this question? They said the law of Moses says that if a man is married and he has no children and he dies, that his brother should marry the woman. And they said, and I wonder if I don't really think this was a real story, but they said it like it was a real story. They said, well, here's a situation that we know of. There was a woman, and she was married, and the husband died, and then there were 7 brothers, and so the second one married her, and he died, and all these brothers kept dying. And, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And what was Jesus' answer?
They don't marry.
Yeah, there is no marriage in the resurrection. And but the passage that they were referring to is from Deuteronomy 25, and it is part of the law of Moses that if a man dies, then his brother should marry the widow. If he dies leaving no heirs, then his brother should marry the wife and bear children for her to continue the name and everything. There's also a related law in the law of Moses, and this is in Numbers 27, having to do with land. So the law is the same kind of situation. If a man dies and he was married but they didn't have any children, then the brothers will have the right to redeem that land, right? And if there are no brothers, then it would go to the father's brothers, and so on until if there are no father's brothers, it would just be the nearest of kin. So you see these 2 related laws, both having to do with if a man dies, leaving no heirs, what should happen to, number 1, his wife and the children that would come, and second, to the land. Those 2 are related, and in this story, they're kind of intertwined. And apparently, culturally, at this time, they were intertwined almost like they were just one. And so that helps us to understand why we have these 2 things combined in this story. So, hope that didn't, put you to sleep. But as we start here in chapter 4, Boaz goes to the gate of the city to wait. Now, why would he go to the gate of the city to wait?
That's where they made big decisions.
That's where people got together. That's where all the gossip of the day went on and everything, and business transactions and stuff. Now, this is an ancient gate. This isn't the gate of Benjamin, which is the gate that Boaz went in. This is the gate of a different city, Gezer. But it shows you what gates were like in that day. There were different chambers. Now, you see this right here? That's a bench. And that's where people would just sit and talk. That's a bench. Now, it's not a very comfortable bench. It's not as comfortable as the ones you are sitting in, but that's what it is. And so that was typical in the gates of the day. So he sits down, and he's hoping that closer relative will come by. And sure enough, he does. And so he says, hey, come sit down here. And then he gathers 10 elders of the city as witnesses. And he says to the relative, basically, there's some land that you have the right to redeem, because you're the closest relative. And it's a land that was left behind by Naomi's husband who died, as well as the land of Mahlon and Chilion, right? The two sons of Naomi. Oh yeah, I'd like that land, he says. And then Boaz says, well, there's a woman involved. You need to know about that too. So you get the land, you're also getting the woman, Ruth. Well, he didn't want to do that. So he says, okay, I'll tell you what, you can have the land. And he did a customary thing in their day, which is you take your sandal off, take your shoe off, and give it to the other person. And that's a way of saying, I give you the rights to the land, right? It's yours. I don't know if he got his shoe back. I imagine he got his shoe back. I think the whole thing was just symbolic and everything. And so that situation was resolved, and the witnesses there. Now I just want to read verses 9 and 10 of Ruth chapter 4. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. And so they get married, and she conceives and gives birth to a son. And what is his name? All right, now it says a little bit later in that, I think it's verse 17, Obed, which means server. And I think the reason he's named that is the women are telling Naomi that this is so wonderful that you now are going to have this man born to your daughter-in-law, and he will restore life and hope to you and will care for you in your old age. You can't imagine how comforting that would be, especially in that culture. And given her whole background in this story. Remember how empty she was? Remember, she was so bitter that what did she tell her friends to call her?
Mara.
Yeah, she said, just call me bitter. I don't want to be called pleasant anymore, Naomi. I want to be called bitter because the Almighty has made my life bitter. He sent me away full and He brought me back empty from Moab and everything because her two sons and her husband died. But now there's all this redemption, and it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful, and to see how God did that in His providence. And God does the same thing in our lives today. And in verses 16 and 17, let's read that. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, so they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So Obed becomes David's grandfather, which means Ruth was his great-grandmother. So this kind of obscure Moabitess becomes part of the lineage of King David and, of course, of Jesus Christ. That's the main point of the book. But there's a lot of other points of application that we get as we go along. One thing I just want to point out here, when it says that she became his nurse, the idea of that is she basically became like his mother. She was the one that would be regarded as his mother. And I think that this would be like an act of grace on the part of Ruth. And look at her kindness here, because Naomi's 2 sons died. Now Ruth has a son, and she says basically, he's for you. You can have a son again. That's pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. But I do think that's the idea. I never noticed that before. I studied for this class. All right, a few points of, generations of Perez. Now, I hope everybody's got all these memorized. I'm sure you do. Perez, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. Can y'all say that? Well, I couldn't unless I was reading it from the screen. But you don't have to remember all that, but do try to remember Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. Try to remember that. That's pretty important. Okay? Yep. Now, 4 lessons that I want to point out that we can get from the book of Ruth. And one of them is acceptance. Now, I don't mean postmodern tolerance of all beliefs and lifestyles and that sort of thing. But you have this lady that she's a foreigner, and she comes in and she is welcomed by the Bethlehemites. She is received by Boaz himself, and it's to me, it's so ironic that all this is happening during the days of the judges. I think God is making a point that, and I'm kind of going off a little bit, but even in the darkest of times, there are good people quietly doing the Lord's work. Isn't that so encouraging? Is it a dark world today? Absolutely. Are there good people quietly doing the Lord's work? Yes. They might be kind of hard to find. They might be hard to find, but they're out there. And so that's the beauty of this book. So you see acceptance, and then you see kindness, and Brian obviously talked about that. I thought that was one of Brian's greatest lessons. It was just so powerful. Thirdly is faithfulness. And so we see the faithfulness of Ruth to her mother-in-law, Naomi, but also her faithfulness to Yahweh and her devotion to Him. And then fourth and finally, redemption. We see the redemption of Naomi, don't we? But we see in a literal way the redemption of Ruth. What do I mean when I say literally?
Well, she actually got a husband and
Yeah.
a child.
I mean, that was a redemption transaction, right? It was like, I'm now buying this. I'm buying the land, and I'm buying the rights to this wonderful woman. Now, I don't know if this is meant to be a foreshadowing of the church, but think about this. We have been redeemed. We are the bride of Christ. We had no future, but Christ bought us with His own blood. He redeemed us and gave us hope. He accepted us in the grace of His kindness, and He is faithful to us. All these things can be applied to the church and to Jesus Christ. Powerful stuff. Okay? Any thoughts or comments before we move past the book of Ruth and get to our review of the quarter? Joe?
I like that. The story of Ruth is powerful, but I like Boaz went about. He wasn't like the near kinsman. He went through the proper channels. Everything was, he did it by the law.
Yes. Right.
That's a powerful thing too, because he could have said, "Well, I'm going to on the down low. I'm going to marry her." It would have been valid and stuff like that.
Right.
It's like you said, this is very much a diamond in the rough when you look at particularly the back side of judgment.
Yeah. Yeah, in addition to the kindness and the acceptance and so forth, you see integrity. Yeah, it's really wonderful. And you also see chastity between Ruth and Boaz. You certainly didn't see that with Samson. Anybody else? Any comments or questions?
Generosity, because he made sure she had enough to glean.
Yes.
He left
Yes.
some.
Oh, yes. And she went home with more than, really probably more than a young lady could carry. Probably meant some strapping young man was carrying all that grain for her. So, yeah, generosity is so refreshing. It's been a joy to kind of dive into this story. Good. Anything else? Any other thoughts or comments? Or questions? I'm not ready to leave Ruth. Like, I just want to stay
I have
here.
one.
What you got?
I think it's interesting that a young lady from another country, another people, took to the rules so quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, believed exactly what her mother-in-law said and did it.
Yeah, you're right. That would not have been easy because she had her own culture and her own family and their own, ways and their own religion and all of that, and she totally committed to the Lord and learned the right path. It's a good lesson. JC.
Just real quick, so some of the other versions make it sound like Naomi actually nursed Obed.
Mm-hmm.
It says she took him to her bosom and nursed him. Is that just symbolic?
I think it's symbolic. Yes, it's. I think it's a term of like raising the child and taking care of the child. Yeah, good question. Very good. In this context, I think that's the idea. But I'm not, the authority on that. But that's my understanding of it. Therefore, it's right. No.
So how long had Naomi had been away and her husband? Because who was taking care of the land?
Right. It was a decade.
It was 10 years, so who was taking care of the land? Because it was still theirs.
Yeah.
I wonder if they just said, okay, neighbors, you can use it while we're gone.
Right.
Just know that it's
You would
ours.
you would hope that maybe the relatives took care of it some, but it would have been either Boaz or the other relative that were close enough to. So I don't know. It might have just not been taken care of, but that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Okay, now let's do our review of this quarter. So we've studied 2 Bible periods in these 3 months. What are those 2 Bible periods? All right, the invasion and conquest of the land and the Judges. Yeah, and those 2 are tied together very naturally. So the invasion and conquest, what's the scriptures that cover that period? What scriptures cover that period? Joshua, yeah. And specifically, Joshua 6 through 24. Because do you remember that the wandering in the wilderness stopped in Joshua 5? Because that's where we have several things happen. Does anybody remember like 1 or 2? That there are 4 things that mark the end of the wandering. All right, so it was right around the time of the crossing of the Jordan, but there was something very specific in chapter 5. A few things, ma'am?
The manna stopped.
The manna stopped. What else?
Moses died.
All right, now Moses dies at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, that's right. So he was dead by now. So that kind of helps to indicate we're moving to a different period.
With all of the men that were of age when they left Israel, Egypt
Yeah.
were gone.
All right, that's right. That's another thing that marks that. Joe?
Wasn't circumcision?
Circumcision. The men are circumcised. The reproach of Egypt is rolled away. And Passover is observed. How many years was it since the very original Passover in Egypt?
40.
Exactly 40. So the wandering in the wilderness doesn't technically come to an end until Joshua chapter 5. Then we have the invasion and conquest starting in Joshua chapter 6. So that one's Joshua 6 through 24, the invasion and conquest. Then we did the period of the Judges. All right, now I've done this a lot with y'all, so just tell me, where do we find the period of the Judges in the Bible? What books? Judges through, through 1 Samuel 9. So Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel 1 through 9. Okay, so very good. Now, a few things here about let's go back to the invasion and conquest, kind of break some of that down. There are 3 campaigns. Y'all remember that? Do you remember which ones and what order they were? All right, so Jericho, yeah, so that's going to be the central campaign, right? So there was Jericho, and what was that little city with that big, huge, long name? Ai. And so, of course, after the destruction of Jericho, they think they're going to conquer Ai, and what happens? Why did they lose?
Because they didn't go to the sin.
There was sin. Who? Achan. It was Achan for breaking, and he was stoned to death, and that sin was stopped, and then they could go on and be victorious. Then after the central campaign, which campaign is next? The northern or the southern? You got a 50-50 shot here. The southern was next, and that had to do with a nation that deceived the Israelites into making an alliance with them. And who was that? All right, that's right, the Gibeonites. So they make this alliance, they form this alliance, and then these southern kings, these kings in the south, headed by the king of Jerusalem, went to go against the Gibeonites to get them to turn back to their side. And what did the Israelites do? They protected them because they had this treaty with them. And so then that battle happens, and that's the battle when Joshua asks something very boldly of the Lord. What does he ask the Lord to do? Cause the sun to stand still. And it does for how long? For about a day. Yeah, for about a day until they defeat the enemy. Then next is, well, can you guess what's next? The next campaign? It's the northern campaign. And this one was basically started by the king of a large city that had 200 acres, whereas Jericho was only 7 acres. But this was a huge walled city of 200 acres. Anybody remember that name? Hazor, yeah. And so the king of Hazor just got together a lot of kings all around and came out against Joshua, and they were defeated too. All right, then the land was divided. Now let's real quick do this thing we've done a couple of times. Which tribe is this one on the top left? That's Asher, okay? And then what about this one next to it, just east of it? All right, that one, now I know why you're saying Zebulun. Zebulun is next to Asher, but it's not right next to it. It's kind of that one that's smushed kind of between them. All right, so we'll get to that. Yeah, so that one's Naphtali, just east of Asher. Then you have this large tribe on the east and west side. That's Manasseh. Then you have this little guy right here next to Asher. All right, Zebulun. I probably shouldn't call a tribe a little guy. And then this one that's south of Zebulun, Issachar. And then you have this one over here that's south of Manasseh. That's Gad. Then you have this one over here just south of Manasseh on the west side, Ephraim. Then you have these two kind of skinny ones. What about this one on the west? All right, that's Dan. And then this one over east of Dan, Benjamin. Then you have this large one under Dan and Benjamin. That's Judah. Then south of Gad. All right, that's Reuben. So you have Reuben, Gad, and a half tribe of Manasseh over here on the east side. And then you have this tribe that's embedded within Judah, which is Simeon, okay? So y'all are doing great. Good job. All right, then the inheritance for the Levites. Everybody remember how many cities the Levites had?
They were spread out over the land.
It was 48.
Oh.
It was 48. Now, somebody said 6. There were 6 of a certain kind of those cities. 6 of those 48 were cities of refuge. So, good. Very good. Then the Trans-Jordanic tribes returned home, and there's a story there about the altar they built on the east side of the Jordan. And what did the tribes on the west side think was going on? Idolatry. Remember that? And they came out to defeat them. And what did Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh say? Why did they have this altar they built?
So it'd be remembered.
Yeah, just as a reminder that we share in the worship on the west side of the Jordan, so don't kill us. And they said, oh, okay, well, we didn't know that. And so they didn't kill them. Then the land promise is fulfilled. I just want to show you, again, look in Joshua 21. This is one of those passages that's good to know. All right, Joshua 21. We'll look starting in verse 43. This is the last few verses of that chapter. So the Lord gave Israel all the land, which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and no one of all of their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. And that is having to do with the blessings of the land and so forth. And now let's look in Joshua chapter 23 and in verse 14. This is in this next to the last speech that Joshua gives. Joshua 23:14. Now behold, today I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you, not one of them has failed. So, do the Jews today still have the right to expect that the land is going to be given to them? No. That promise was already fulfilled in the day of Joshua. You see that? And it was contingent upon their what? Obedience. Their obedience. And when they rejected God, he kicked them out. He spewed them out, as he told them that he would. He did bring back a remnant, but then, the remnant failed to live up to God's plan as well. So those passages I just showed you are foundational. Those are really good to know where they are. And try to just at least remember the last verse of chapter 21. If you can't remember that other one, you can always look at the center column and it'll lead you to the other one. All right. Now, little by little. So we're getting into the book of Judges now. And so you have the exploits of the tribes. They're trying to drive out the enemies. But what was the result of that? Yeah, they drove some of them out. A lot of them just became slaves and thorns in their sides and everything like that. So then you have the visit from the angel of the Lord. I believe that's in Judges chapter 2. And what does the angel of the Lord tell the people? You weren't supposed to make covenants with these people and everything, but you haven't listened to God. And so God's going to let these people stay, and they're going to become a real problem for you. And they do become a problem for them. That kind of defines the rest of the book of Judges. Then we have this recurring cycle. And there are 5 things. What does it kind of start with? What starts the cycle over every time?
Sin.
Yeah, sin. Their apostasy. And then they would commit this apostasy. What would happen as a result? Yeah, they'd get oppressed and afflicted by the people that were in the land. And when that would happen, all this terrible oppression, what would the people respond and do? All right, they would repent, they would cry out to God for help. And when they did that, what would God do? Yeah, he was true to his covenant, wasn't he? And even though they were wicked, even though we're wicked, if we truly repent, and call out to God for deliverance, he will be true to his covenant. And then once that they were delivered, what would be the next part of this? All right, that would be peace, and then back to apostasy. Okay? Very good. Now, I'm not going to make you just repeat all the judges. We've done that enough. But I want you to help me, just tell me one simple fact about each of these judges. Now, a couple of these judges, there's not any real specific, interesting fact that you may be able to even recall. But for most of them, there is. So, like Othniel, what can we say about him?
Oh, no.
Not yet. Not yet. Not the ox goad yet. But what was Miss B saying? Okay, now that's going to be Ehud. Yeah?
He defeated Cushan, I can't say the last.
Okay, the king of Mesopotamia, yes. But the thing that I like about him is he was Caleb's younger brother. Remember Joshua and Caleb? Okay? All right, so then we have Ehud. Now, what was it about Ehud? Yeah, his story, is just one that's really kind of gory, and he's left-handed, and he kills the king of Moab with a dagger because it was on his right thigh, and it wasn't suspected, and all of that. Yeah. All right, who's after Ehud? Shamgar. And we just have like one verse. I think there's only one verse on Shamgar. What does it tell us about him?
600 people in Oxford.
600 people, yes, but what kind of people?
Philistines.
Philistines. So they're a problem way back in that time. All right, very good. Then you have Deborah,
Woman judge.
the only woman judge, right? Now, I just have a little fun trivia with you for a minute. Let's see if you can remember a couple of names. Who was the man that she told to go and defeat the Canaanites? Barak, right? Of course, he was kind of cowardice, kind of a coward, and said, well, I'll do it if you go to battle. And so she said, well, all right, well, the victory is going to be given to a woman. And who was that woman that the victory was given to? Jael. And she killed the commander of the army of the Canaanites, whose name was? Sisera. Hey, you guys are doing great. All right, then we have Gideon. So much about Gideon, it's impossible for me to just review it all, but can you tell me what comes to your mind when you think of Gideon?
300 men.
300 men. Started. Yes, yeah, the ones that pulled it up to their face. Sir?
I think they started with 32,000.
32,000. That's exactly right. And then it went down to
20, I think.
20,000. No, I think it went down to 10. I think it went down to 10,000 and then down to 300. All right. The end of his story, or his last story, is sad, isn't it? What does his last story involve? That golden ephod that he had made that became an item used in idol worship. All right, Abimelech. What comes to your mind with Abimelech?
Killed all his brothers.
Yeah, self-appointed leader, killed all his brothers except one.
False judge.
False judge, not really. He wasn't appointed by God at all, was he, Herb? How did he die?
Killed by a woman.
Woman
pushed a millstone on his
All right. Well, that's what hastened his death, but he actually had his armor bearer to kill him. That was kind of a trick question. That was mean, wasn't it? All right. Nothing real interesting about Tola or Jair. Then we have Jephthah. What is it about Jephthah?
Rash vow.
Yeah, the rash vow and that whole controversy. Did he offer his daughter as a burnt offering, or did he commit her to the Lord as sort of a devotion to devote her life to the Lord and everything? And that's a real controversy. There are good arguments on both sides. Brian leans towards that second one, but we can't know for sure on that. That's just a toughie. That is a toughie. All right, then we have Ibzan, and then who's after Ibzan? Elon. And then who's after Elon? Abdon. They're not real interesting. Now, I'm not trying to be insulting to them. It's probably because things were peaceful in their day. So there's just not a lot that they had to do in terms of deliverance. Samson. Now, what comes to your mind? What's the first thing? Drink. What's that? Jawbone of a donkey. I heard you say something about a donkey. So yeah, the jawbone of a donkey, and he killed how many Philistines with that jawbone? 1,000, right? And what kind of vow was he under? Nazarite vow and everything.
And he was a womanizer.
He liked women.
How many women are focused on in his story?
3 or 4.
There are 3. There's 3. Remember who was the first one?
His wife.
And the woman in Timnah that he married, right? And then who's the second one? A prostitute in the city of Gaza. And then who's the third one? Delilah. And all these women just, brought pain in his life, but it was his own choice to pursue them. All right, then we have Eli. All right, what about Eli? What comes to your mind with Eli?
He did not restrain his son.
Okay.
Priest.
All right.
He raised Samuel.
Okay, good. So he was high priest. He raised Samuel. Who was Samuel's mother? Hannah. Very good. And she wanted a child. She was barren. And she came to now let me ask you a couple more questions. I'm kind of going random here, a little bit scatterbrained. But we've got Hannah, and who was her husband? All right. Now, who was the other wife? Penina. Okay. And Penina, what was their relationship? Yeah, Penina was mean. She was cruel. Sir?
She was a bully.
She was a bully. She really was. And so Hannah went to the temple. And when we talked about the temple, it's called the temple, but what did we say was kind of unique about that? That's right. The temple's not built yet. The temple isn't built until the days of Solomon in the United Kingdom. But it's called the temple. Now, do you remember how I explained? Of course, the tabernacle was in Shiloh. But what did I explain might be the reason that it's called a temple? Mary?
Because there was a permanent structure built over it.
Yes. And I think that's very obvious when you read the text, especially the passage that says, when Samuel got up that morning after the Lord had spoke to him, he went to open the doors of the temple. And so it had been there actually for 400 years, the tabernacle had. So I think it had to be covered up by something in order to remain there and everything. Okay, good. Who were Eli's two sons? All right, Hophni and Phinehas. And, okay, now Phinehas, remember after the ark was stolen and the news of Hophni and Phinehas' death was brought to the wife of Phinehas, she was giving birth. Remember that? What was the name? Ichabod. Okay. See, this kind of stuff is fun to me.
Means the glory has departed.
The glory has departed. Then other events. Now we won't go into detail because we've spent time on this here just recently. The migration of the Danites. Now this story is centered around really one man and his false worship to Jehovah and everything. And who is that man that it's really mainly centered on? Micah. And he appoints this priest. And then that priest is stolen away, actually is just convinced to come and be the priest to the Danites and everything. All right, then the sin of the men of Benjamin. So what does this involve?
The misuse of the concubine.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a concubine that is raped and killed, and it's homosexuality and everything. And then we have the refreshing story of Ruth to kind of balance things out a little bit at least. So that's it. Now I'm going to take comments or questions at this point. We have about a minute and a half. So does anybody have anything from the entire quarter that you'd like to say or ask this time?
I think you show that cycle, and I think that's a cycle we all see in our own life. And I think that it's a very dangerous cycle for us. And I think being aware of it is half the battle, and we need to realize that when we let little things go, it can have big consequences. I mean, you think of, well, it wasn't so bad. They made a deal with the Gibeonites, right? You know, they weren't going to kill these people. They were nice enough, but they didn't do what God said. And that little deviation from God's plan led to tremendous trouble. The angel said, the gods of these people will be attractive.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we let little things go, we allow these quote-unquote gods of the world
Good.
to trap at us.
Good point. Good. Anybody else? Terry.
One of the things I take away is make sure that we're seeking God's will and His desire before we act, instead of acting.
Amen.
It's a corrective thing that we've done. We just try to do what His will is beforehand.
Amen. Yeah. And sadly, it is easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. You know, we're going to have that saying, but it's wrong. You know, it's wrong to always just go forward and then ask for forgiveness later. We need to make sure it's right first. Good point. Hey. All right. Books are in the back if you want to go ahead, even though it's going to be a little while before our first class will be April 1st. And the syllabi are back there if you want to grab one as well.